On today's Locked On Bucks, we get into the latest reporting from Shams Charania, what to expect and when it comes to Giannis's availability for this first round series against the Indiana Pacers. How important is Giannis's availability going to be? And we revisit some very, very interesting comments from Malik Beasley just a few months ago. Camille and I get into all of that and more coming up after this on today's Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. She's Camille Davis. I'm Justin Garcia here with you. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts and viewable on YouTube, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I'll admit, just as you did, Camille, I also have a very competitive side. It is a big part of me, and it makes me a big fan of Monopoly Go. The mobile hit twist on the classic Monopoly. Join your friends and download Monopoly Go now, free on the App Store or Google Play. So we start with what we led with in the intro there, Camille, and that is the update from Shams Charania of The Athletic when it comes to Giannis, and that update is no real update. I don't think I'm going to speak for you here. I don't think it was any surprise for you. It wasn't for me to learn, hey, Giannis's status is still very much up in the air at best. Doubtful probably is the most realistic for game one of this series. So I guess I said I don't think you're surprised, but I'll start there. How surprised, if at all, were you to get that report? And just, I'm not going to ask you, when do you think Giannis will come back? But I mean, would you agree that the Bucks have to approach this series with the assumption Giannis is not going to be available? If he comes back, great. We're game planning for the Pacers without Giannis.
I think that's the best place to start. I saw people, bringing up on Twitter, finding the old tweets from the NBA Finals run where Giannis was listed as doubtful for game one of the NBA Finals. And like, hey, remember this? Like, he was doubtful then too. Like, he's going to play game one. And I just feel like, let's not say and assume that he is going to be healthy for game one. Frank tweeted out, and I agreed wholeheartedly, where he just said, like, we have gotten used to Giannis's Wolverine-like ability to heal, but it's unfair for us to just think it's going to always be that way or expect him to be back game one. Now, again, calf injuries are tough. When you have the soft tissue injuries, those can be difficult to come back from. There's no question that he is approaching his rehab as diligently as he possibly can. We know that Giannis wants to play, especially given that it's against the Pacers, a team where, like, Locked On comments, listen, in the YouTube, when I was mentioning the Giannis, it was a Giannis quote, y'all, when I mentioned how he said, you think about it when you're getting freaky. That wasn't me mentioning that. It's something that Giannis said. And with that, something that he said, this is a matchup that he definitely wants to get back on the court for. But, like, I just think it's safe to assume that they're not going to have him at least to start this series. And some of the comments you've heard from Doc, from Chris and Dame as well, have you think like it feels like they are also aware that they might not have him to start, and they're getting ready to gear up to take the responsibility that they need to have to cover for him until he can make it back to the lineup.
Yeah, I mean, Doc has, whenever he's been asked about it, and Doc has, as we've experienced, has been a pretty forthcoming guy when it comes to his appearances in the media. But Doc has kind of long maintained hopeful when asked about, hey, is Giannis going to be ready? Yeah, we're hopeful. Hope, as it was famously once put, is a good thing, maybe even the best of thing, and no good thing ever dies. But that doesn't mean for the start of the playoffs. And I think that would be my big caution is, yes, I'm sure he's hopeful you will have Giannis in this series or in the playoffs. It doesn't necessarily mean game one. But as you and I talked about a little bit yesterday, look, this is why you go out and you trade for Damian Lillard, because if something happens to Giannis, the way this team was constructed in the past, sure, you still have Chris Middleton and Brook Lopez and Bobby Portis. And with those versions of the team, Drew Holiday, but you didn't have a star, a superstar, that you could say, okay, it's on you. We need you to be the guy that takes us home. It was more of a collective effort. And which one of those is better? Who knows? I think every scenario is different. But that's the logic behind bringing in Damian Lillard, not only to fix that offense that we talked about really stalling for the Bucks, but to have another security blanket in case something happens. And you mentioned some of the comments trying to kind of read between the lines what the feeling is with the team. I think some of what Damian Lillard said after the game too about their offense. And, look, we can't get away with stuff like this and the way we move the ball or played offensively. You can't get away with that in the postseason where all of these possessions matter and your movement matters. Whether or not that means it matters even more when you don't have Giannis, who knows? But, the mindset has to be, look, Giannis is obviously a huge blow if we don't have him for game 1 or games, 1 through 4, whatever it is. But we should believe within the locker room that we have Damian Lillard, we have Chris Middleton, we have Brook Lopez. We are still a good enough team to beat this Indiana Pacers team, even without Giannis.
And they should feel that way. I mean, missing Giannis is a big piece of it. He averaged like 42 and 13 against the Pacers this season. Like, the lack of rim protection is something that's glaring from the Pacers side. And, they go out and get Pascal Siakam to try to help shore that up a little bit, but that's still an area to attack. So having someone like Giannis in the lineup is a way to exploit a perceived weakness of that Pacers team. So without him, it goes to some of the things you've been hearing the team talk about, which is we have to play big. Even if Giannis isn't out there, we have to find ways to get Brook involved, to get Bobby involved. If there's a mismatch, we have to exploit it. Now, the piece without Giannis that gets tricky, given the construction of this Bucks roster, is when it comes to that playmaking and that shot creation aspect of it all, because it's really Giannis, it's Dame, and it's Chris who are your real 3 playmakers and shot creators on this team. So when you lose Giannis, you're losing a big piece of it. Like, what's going to be the lineups when Dame's on the bench? Like, you would hope that the stagger is with Chris out there, but like, you're going to have to deal with some minutes where it's just Dame on the floor or just Chris on the floor. That secondary playmaker isn't there necessarily. So like, how do you operate the offense around that? So that's going to be a big piece of Giannis as missing as well. Like, of course, you point to the point production, you point to the rebounds, but also just that playmaking and facilitating and just kind of getting guys into advantageous spots for the other guys to really shine and make some big moments happen during the game as well.
Yeah, and I think, certainly as the week goes on, we are going to preview the series in much more detail here. We're going to revisit some of those previous 5 games that these two teams played against each other. As we've pointed out a number of times, these are 2 very different teams since that 5th matchup on January 3rd, both the Bucks and the Pacers. I mentioned all of the guys that are no longer there, or maybe not quite as efficient as they were during that series for the Pacers, but it's also worth pointing out Pascal Siakam, as you just noted, wasn't there for those 5 games. So they're 2 very different teams since those games were played, and that's the interesting part is not just in this series, but, overall, I think the big takeaway, and this is more of a larger discussion that I think we'll get into later on the show, is, what do you take away from the regular season in general? That it's, and this isn't Bucks fans or whatever saying, well, it wasn't a great regular season, so I don't know what to make of that regular season. Just across the board, I don't know what to take from the regular season anymore. It's moving closer and closer to that. So as I mentioned, we'll take a closer look at some of those matchups a little bit later in the week and revisit what went wrong for the Bucks, not so much what went right if you only won 20% of your games against that team. But we'll do that as Locked On Bucks rolls along this week. But coming up after the break, we are going to take a look at one of those players because he had some very interesting things to say that I think a lot of Bucks fans remembered at the time that it happened. A lot may have forgotten, and we will revisit those comments by Malik Beasley somewhat 3 months ago, almost to the day that Malik Beasley made these comments as it relates to the Indiana Pacers. So Camille and I will get into that discussion coming up after this on Locked On Bucks. Well, today's Locked On Bucks is sponsored by BetterHelp. And look, as we've all talked about, sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest, big or small. there are things that can really start to get to you. So it is important to let that out, especially to someone who's unbiased on your life. So today, once again, I want to say how I really feel about something. And you may even be thinking the same thing. At the risk of sounding like a homer and an apologist, I'm going to again come to the defense of Doc Rivers, as we've talked about quite a bit on this show. It's entirely unfair to just point to Doc Rivers' record. None of us are suggesting it's great, but I think there's a lot of nuanced discussion that lives behind that. And as we've all learned, if you're the guy that defends Doc Rivers on the internet, you are going to become the laughingstock of social media. So that can be a difficult conversation to have, but it's important to get it out of the way, just as it is important to get anything affecting you in your life out of the way. That is where BetterHelp can come in with the assist. If you are thinking of starting therapy, then give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It is designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. All you have to do is visit betterhelp.com/lockedonnba, and you can get 10% off your first month. Now, look, therapy can be different for everyone. Most of us have much bigger problems than worrying about how the public is going to perceive us for defending an NBA coach. But the point is, those problems exist for all of us, and finding the best way to deal with those problems is where BetterHelp can give you that assist and help you figure out ways to get things off your chest every once in a while. Once again, the website is betterhelp.com/lockedonnba, and you'll get 10% off your first month. That is BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedonnba. It is Locked On's NFL mock draft live April 17th. That is just 2 days from now, 7 p.m. Eastern time. You can find it streaming on Locked On Sports Today, 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Find the ultimate 6-episode series on April 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern time to hear who the local Locked On experts are picking for every NFL franchise. Live reactions from local college football experts, even the fantasy football angle. The Locked On NFL mock draft on April 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern, streaming live on Locked On Sports Today, 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. All right, Camille, I mentioned we were going to bring up one individual player, and that player is Malik Beasley, who that was the Chris Haynes podcast, I believe he was on in January. It was shortly after, I think it was early, first week of January, a couple of days after that 5th game in which the Bucks lost, and had basically said, they're a team that sometimes there's a team that's just the thorn in your side in the regular season. They're confident against us. They think they can beat us. That's great. But we're going to face them in the playoffs. Malik Beasley was the prophet that said this on January 5th. We are going to face Indiana in the playoffs, and it's not going to be pretty for them. So on the one hand, it is, okay, I like the confidence. On the other, there's the adage of be careful what you wish for because you may just get it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that's what he wants. He wants the smoke, not running from the smoke at all. So, you like that energy. But with that, this is a Bucks team that clearly knows, during the regular season, this Pacers team got the best of them. Got the best of them in Vegas. They got the best of them and in Milwaukee, just period. I mean, going 1-4 against them this season, doesn't inspire much confidence, but it just goes to show how the Bucks feel like those are games where it was on them and mistakes that they made more so than things that the Pacers were doing, which one can argue that's a good way to look at it, or you can be like, hey, you got to clean some things up there. But with that and knowing the energy that's coming into this game, the basketball matchup between the two of them is really interesting because of the pace that the Pacers like to play in. And it's going to be interesting to see how much that slows down in the playoffs and if the Bucks transition defense can actually get back and defend well, if the offense can play the way it needs to be played for the Bucks, where the ball's not getting stuck and they are de facto giving the Pacers just an advantage for them to start off their offense. But with the bad blood between these two teams, and I'll put bad bloods in quotations there, but the emotional aspect of it, because after the Magic game, both Chris and Dame were asked about that. And I thought that was so interesting to think about when you think about some of the key players on this Milwaukee Bucks team being Bobby Portis and Patrick Beverly, two guys who, and even Jay Crowder, guys who Doc Rivers have said like they're instigators. Like these are guys that it's fine as long as you play within a certain line, but you don't want to cross it. And that's something that Chris mentioned too. Like you get to the playoffs and the stakes are higher. So the emotions are going to be high. It's more on the line. Your season's on the line, like at this point, but you have to keep emotions in check. You have to focus on the game and not let your emotions get the best of you and take you away from the game. And Dame added, like, you got to be responsible when it comes to that. We can't be overly emotional because in the playoffs, that can change a series. I know you get too emotional, you can be taken advantage of. So it's important for us to not come out emotional about this. Like, we got to keep our composure and act like the veteran team that we are. So again, the trash talking, all that happened back in January is cool. And we know this is a matchup that the Bucks are going to be looking forward to, but that emotional aspect of it is going to be a big part, especially if there's no Giannis, and Bobby Portis is going to be dependent on to be a starter for this team as well. Like that emotional aspect is going to be real for this team.
I'm glad you brought up that last part. That is something to certainly keep an eye on because of the importance of Bobby Portis. And that's, look, another area where the Bucks are very fortunate to have Bobby Portis. I saw Bobby Portis's social accounts putting out his candidacy for Sixth Man of the Year. And some of those numbers even caught me off guard of, oh, you know what? I didn't realize that part. But the Bucks are lucky to have Bobby Portis, and especially knowing he plays the same position as Giannis. So when Giannis goes down, here's this guy that, you and I have talked about. Giannis has been the consistency in a year filled with change for this group. Bobby Portis may be the second most consistent guy that the Bucks have had.
After All-Star, yeah.
Especially after All-Star. He's had some ups and downs, but Bobby Portis may be that second most consistent guy that this team has had all season long. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on too, is do teams say, look, we feel like we can get to him. We think we can get under his skin. And especially without Giannis, that would be a huge loss for the Bucks if something happened that would jeopardize Bobby Portis's availability for a game. But speaking of Malik Beasley, again, we'll get to the X factors and everything else about this series a little bit later in the week. But I think he's going to be a very important player in this series for the Bucks because number one, you made the comment, so you better not run from them and you better contribute to that. But also, there is a chance that the Bucks can almost flip the script on the Pacers and what they did to them, not in terms of the pace of the game and how that's played, but some of the big areas where the Pacers seized advantage against the Bucks were clearly the speed that they were playing at. They were running on everything. They were causing turnovers. They were just a very chaotic group that it felt like the Bucks were unsettled and not really ready for that. Their bench production, though, and as we talked about this team being very different and the Bucks different since the last time they played, the Pacers bench was maybe not the strength or their biggest strength, but a very big strength for them early in the season, especially. That has taken some hits with the trade of Buddy Hield, with the injury to Benedict Mathurin, and everything else. Tyrese Halliburton and how that's caused more playing time for TJ McConnell. It hasn't quite been the same group. And with this shift to the starting lineup where Malik Beasley is now coming off the bench, we assume that's going to remain the case when the playoffs open. What that gives the bench is Malik Beasley and Bobby Portis, two guys that can score off the bench and can give you some of what the Pacers were doing earlier in the season. I stress can because it's really been kind of a tale of two seasons for Malik Beasley. When you think back to the guy he was during those first 5 games, where I think he shot better than 40% on his 3-point attempts in those 5 matchups against the Indiana Pacers, played a lot of minutes as well, as that was a perimeter heavy team. And in the first half of the season, Malik's minutes, even with that shift out of the starting lineup the last couple of games, his minutes per game were nearly identical pre-All-Star break and post-All-Star, but the shooting variance was massive. He was a 44% 3-point shooter in the first half of the season, lower than 40% after All-Star break, where I think it settled at about 38% that Malik finished at after the All-Star break. So he doesn't need to hit 45% of his shots, but it's been, and I mentioned that, 37, 38% shooting after the break. it's been even lower than that in the month of April and late March. It's been really a month of struggles for Malik Beasley. And that, especially if you're playing without Giannis, that is not the version that you can get of Malik Beasley and still feel very good about this series.
You need him to show up because, as you mentioned, with him and Bobby Portis being the two guys coming off the bench that you're looking for that scoring punch, if there's no Giannis, then that moves Bobby into the starting lineup hypothetically there. So then you
Yeah.
lose that other piece of bench scoring that you normally can lean on. So then it's like, well, who else outside of Bees are you going to be looking at? Like, how does the rotation change now if Giannis is not playing? Like, who else gets into the game here? But Bees is going to be one of those swing pieces. And with Bees coming into this playoff series, especially seeing how this season has gone for him and then how last season ended for him, where he was unplayable in the playoffs, according to the Lakers, because of the defense and because of the streaky shooting, where they're like, there's just the advantage isn't there to have you on the court. And that's part of what Beasley has been motivated by this season. He signed here for that very low contract, just thinking, I just need the chance to really show what I can do. He's been putting in the time. He mentioned even in LA, like, I didn't get to the gym as much as I needed to in that environment. Like, I'm taking this season a lot more seriously than I did last season. And he's had the shooting struggles. He even mentioned, I forget which 3-point record it was for him I think it was 5 or more threes in a game this season. And he mentioned, like, I was just so in my head, like, it wasn't flowing for me. So that's the piece with Malik Beasley, it seems like, as well, is making sure the confidence is there, making sure he's getting his touches, making sure he's able to get good shots up where the ball's moving and you're finding them. So he is going to be a very big piece, especially without Giannis, because he is going to be the majority of, like, that bench scoring power.
Yeah, and Malik played 11 games in the playoffs last year for the Lakers. They played, I think, 17 or 18 total games. So to that point that you made, he wasn't seeing that consistent runtime. And towards the end, too, a lot of that was really that first round series against the Memphis Grizzlies, the conference finals against the Denver Nuggets. Malik, I think, did not play at all in 3 of those 4 games. The games that he did play in after that first round series, the minutes started to drastically fall off. 3.5 minutes, just under 3 minutes in game 5 against the Warriors, 5 minutes in game 3 against the Warriors. So towards the back half of that playoff run by the Lakers, he basically was a non-factor. And as you pointed out, that was one of the reasons for Malik Beasley choosing the Bucks and wanting to kind of say, okay, I need some redemption from that postseason run. So he is certainly one of those guys that is going to be very, very important for the Bucks as the postseason begins. Again, we'll get into more of what to expect and how the matchups look, preview that series with the Pacers in quite a bit more detail as the week progresses here. But coming up after the break, I do want to get into a conversation that you and I were talking about before that has bounced around about how the Bucks handled the final game of the regular season, and also if the playoff format needs to undergo some change, as that has been another very, very popular topic of discussion. So we will get into that conversation coming up after this on Locked On Bucks. Well, I've been told I am a competitive person. I know I have a competitive side. We all do, and my competitive side is a big fan of Monopoly Go. I'm sure you've heard of it. It has been downloaded over 150 million times. It is a great twist on Monopoly where you can play on not one, but hundreds of Monopoly boards in crazy locations, building up amazing cities that bring you big money. The best part of all this, though, is messing with all of my friends that also get in on Monopoly Go. I can charge them rent on my iconic properties, just like you can on the classic Monopoly board game. But now you can also rob their vaults of riches for yourself. And the leaderboards show you the biggest Monopoly tycoon there is. It's not just my competitive side that loves it. And it's not just your competitive side that will love it. You can team up with friends and people all around the world in timed tournaments to earn huge rewards. So get in on the game and join your friends. Don't download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or Google Play. All right. So a couple of things to get to as we start to wrap here, Camille. Number one, the narrative that started floating around of, man, all these teams are ducking the Sixers. Look, I think it's pretty clear the Cleveland Cavaliers were ducking the Philadelphia 76ers. And I think it's pretty clear the New York Knicks said, we don't care. We'll play the 76ers or whoever it is. But I've seen the Bucks, and you have too, lumped in with the Cavs and some other teams of, man, look at all these teams that were terrified of the 76ers. Look, in fairness, I don't know. Maybe there was some of that thought. As Doc Rivers said, we're going to monitor minutes for some guys. Maybe the Bucks thought, look, ideally, we'd rather not have to worry about Philly. But to me, in just watching that game against the Orlando Magic, I did not take that as a team that said, we're losing this game at all costs. We don't want the 76ers. That was just a bad performance by the Bucks.
Yep. I mean, you saw that with OKC too. Like, of course, there was no Giannis, and we saw the injury report initially where it's like, oh, they're just resting everybody. But then you see like, oh, actually, okay, Chris is playing. Okay, Brooke is playing in this game. So it's like down the stretch for this Bucks team, especially this game against Orlando here, it's not that the Bucks were trying to duck Orlando or give up the 2 seed, or not duck Orlando, duck Philly. Like, against Orlando, like they were just bad. Like you saw them trying to win. Like they had a great first quarter. Then they got punched in the mouth in the second quarter and they never recovered from that. It just snowballed to the point where then it's like, okay, Doc's like, I'm just going to throw the reserves in because this game feels out of pocket. Like we're just not going to get it today. So like, let's call it one. I don't see them in the same light as I do with like Cleveland. There are people pointing to like, oh, I mean, they've been tanking the whole way down. Like this Bucks team did not try to go 3-8 over the last, last 11 games here. Like they've talked about, like it was embarrassing for them to go through that. And that's not something that a team is trying to do when they're playing who they can play. Because as we've mentioned, like the lineup, people have been in and out of lineups. We saw Giannis get hurt during that Boston game. Dame missed some time during that stretch of those last 11 games. Chris missed 2 games down the stretch. So like there were some guys in and out, but it was for some injury reasons. And it's just saying the Bucks were trying to duck smoke, I feel like doesn't give enough accountability to how bad they were playing. Like it absolves them. I feel like when you just use the narrative of, oh, they were just trying to like manipulate the standings. Like, no, they were playing bad, and it's okay to call it out when you're seeing the team not performing that way. Like it was just bad ball.
What's interesting to me is we talk, and you haven't heard a ton of it. I'm sure it's going to ramp up this week, but the talk about the basketball gods, and we all love to point back to 2021 and find any comps that we can to that year. And I remember thinking, okay, I remember the approach that the Bucks came away with that final weekend of 2021 was, we don't care who we get. But even 3 years removed, trying to figure out what were those scenarios again. It took me going back and looking up some of those games and realizing the Bucks basically punted that last game. Like I knew there was hey, there's a chance that you could avoid Miami, but running through what those scenarios were once again and seeing, okay, so that final regular season game, it wasn't that the Bucks won, obviously not, since it's 11 years since they've won on the final day, but the way they handled it and said, we don't care who we get. We're going to rest everybody that we have. And they knew going into that day, there was a long shot, but a chance they could get the 2 seed if they won and the Brooklyn Nets lost. It was a moot point because the Brooklyn Nets lost. And I remember on my post-game show, national analysis as well, was, what are the Bucks doing? Why would you do this? Even though it was out of their hands with the Brooklyn Nets winning that game regardless. But why would you have this approach going into that weekend when this is the same Miami Heat team that beat you in the postseason a year ago and ended your season? And I guess the long and short of it is, you can go through all that angling and maneuvering. And I think that was the approach the Bucks had, is we don't care. We're not going to risk an injury. We're not going to, overextend ourselves, because what happens. We can do everything that we want. If Brooklyn wins, it takes it out of our hands. So whoever we get in the first round, that's who we were meant to play. I don't know if it was, to a T, the same approach they had here, but I don't think it was what we saw the following year, which I think was one of the more disheartening parts of it. Was that Bucks team that we all loved and embraced, the way that they said, we don't care, we want Miami. It was the exact opposite approach that they had when they drew the Bulls in the first round and were the 3 seed once again were the 2 seed versus the 3 seed. So that was the interesting part of, so many things go into this, but it's all about the public perception. I'm frankly stunned that the Cavaliers, I know there's been some backlash from Brian Windhorst and Tim Bontemps and some others, but I'm frankly stunned the Cavaliers have not been raked over the coals even more for the way they approached that game, not just with the injury report, but did you see any of the fourth quarter and the lineups that they were playing in the fourth where it was basically an all big man?
Yeah, all the bigs. Yeah, it was strange, but it's like they came out like Bickerstaff was saying, like, we had a plan going to the game, like we knew guys were having a minute limit, and it's like, okay, I can hear you on that, but like you were seeing how the scores were breaking down, and it's of course it's difficult to like keep track of everything going on around you while you're in the middle of a game. But like I've been in NBA arenas, like they're showing scores from other games. Like we have smartphones. Like
yeah,
you can be tapped in and aware of how
it's
things
safe
are going.
to assume not assistants on the bench, but coach, other assistants in the film room, medical staff. There were people well aware of what the scores were in Orlando and at Madison Square Garden that could have notified JB Bickerstaff of, hey, maybe we should put those guys back in and try to win this.
Like their fans were booing at the end of the game. Like Cleveland fans were just kind of like, what are we like? Even the fans in the building are booing. Like, what? How did we lose? Like, why did we do this? Like, what is the point? But now it's set. And now Cleveland finds themselves in the matchup against Orlando. And it's a series where it's like, I think Cleveland's going to be seen as a favorite, but Orlando has a shot at winning in that series. So it's like, sure, okay, you avoided Philly, but what if your avoidance of Philly? And I should also say, if people are assuming Philly's going to be the 7 seed, like there's a possibility that Philly ends up the 8 seed playing Boston for all we know. And it's actually, Miami in that 7 seed. So like, it's hard to know what you're dodging. And the way this season went until the last day. So all the things before the last day of trying to manipulate standings, like everything was so close and so jumbled. It was really hard to do so. And then once the clarity came on the last day of the season of here's the possibilities, here's what you need to do. Seeing Cleveland approach it that way was disappointing. I get why there were fans booing.
That one of those last points you made, it does kind of seem like we are setting up for the Miami Heat to win that game because everybody is assuming, oh, you don't want the 2 seed because it means you're getting Philly. That the saying about best laid plans. And look, if that is in fact the scenario, and let's say the 76ers lose but beat the Bulls or the Hawks, whoever it is, and you have a Boston versus Philadelphia matchup in the first round, there are 2 things to come from that. Number one, you will have that unique spot I don't ever remember seeing, at least in the East, where all 4 teams that enter the series as the underdog are going to say, we think we're going to win this series.
Yeah.
We think we match up pretty well with this team. And, the other parts of it is if you have that in Philadelphia as the 8 seed playing the Boston Celtics, who steamrolled everyone through the regular season, that more than anything to kind of round things out with the last point we wanted to get to would be the talking points behind prompting more change to this postseason. We talked about it last year. Some of it was just crying over spilled milk as a Bucks fan, but hey, I mean, the Miami Heat were not really an 8 seed. Like, how can the Bucks get saddled with this? If the Boston Celtics and the Boston sports media have to, again, I don't think it would happen, but suffer defeat in the first round against the Philadelphia 76ers as an 8 seed, I think the talk of maybe we should revisit the playoff format is going to intensify, at least with that play-in tournament. And that brings us to, speaking of Boston sports media, Kevin O'Connor yesterday created a firestorm with his tweet basically complaining about the way that teams handled the final weekend and what it does for competition, but also why can't teams just choose who they're going to play in the playoffs? I'll start with this. I would be very intrigued by that. My curiosity is I wonder what the players and organizations would think about those optics of, oh, so you think you can beat us, huh? Getting out there. But obviously, it's human nature to be compelled by, okay, I want to see which teams think that little of the other teams, right? it's great to fantasize about this. I just don't see a scenario where this is feasible because you would basically have to eliminate the play-in tournament.
Yeah, and the play-in tournament has been a success. Like, it has helped other teams who would normally, during the end of the season, just come up, we're mailing this one in, go for it. It's changed even the trade deadline market, where teams are evaluating where they are as buyers or sellers because they're looking at their opportunity, maybe sticking to that playing game, or saying like, well, if we just get healthy, like, I feel good about us getting here if we can just figure out a way to get into the dance. And with the NBA, we know, hey, we're in America. It's a capitalist society. The NBA, they're trying to make money. And the play-in has proven to be a formula that works to bring in money and kind of these pseudo playoff games into markets, which helps out those teams as well. I just, like you said, I think the picking of the teams is a cool concept, similar to how I enjoyed when the All-Star was having the drafts, where it's really cool to see players picking who they want on their team. Like, it's a, recess game where you're in the back and you're like, okay, we're just picking squads right now. But I don't see it happening, because I don't see that being a bigger money maker than what they already have currently in place.
The All-Star draft with the infamous, what was Charles Barkley's line when LeBron was thinking about James Harden and drafting him? Is he available? He was traded. So yeah, he's available.
I'll never forget KD's face too, just like straight face, not picking James Harden no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, look, it would be certainly fascinating, but I think that's the thing is there something to it? Yeah, that I get the, well, what's your reward if this is the case? If we would have potentially 2 years in a row where you would have this 8 seed that is not actually an 8 seed, as you and I talked about quite a bit on yesterday's show. Philly is really a 2 or a 3 seed with the way that they played before Joel's injury and the way they've looked since then. And that would, if there was going to be a change, that would be what would spark the most change. If not only 2 years in a row, but especially if it happened to the Celtics and the way that the Celtics have looked this season. But yeah, with play-in tournament, with trying to then determine, okay, we know all teams that are in Friday, 2 days before the playoffs official, or a day before the playoffs officially again, then trying to work around arena availability and shared arenas with the NHL. It's just a logistical nightmare. And I think what the league would counter with is what you said. The play-in tournament has been a massive success. Last year you had 2 teams reach the conference finals, one reached the finals.
Yeah.
It has sparked the interest. It has shifted that trade deadline, as you referenced, and how teams approach that. It has made those games more competitive the final month of the season with those teams outside of the postseason. That it's really just, the first part of the season that you would point to and say that's the problem that needs to be addressed. I think the league would say we've done that with the play-in or with the in-season tournament.
Yep. That's their solution. Like, that got eyes on the product before Christmas, which is the day that people normally say this is when the NBA season starts, on Christmas Day, because they're competing with the NFL. And now the NFL is also doing Christmas Day games again this year. So, like, nothing is sacred anymore, Justin.
No, nothing is safe. The NFL is, as we've learned, coming for everything. On tomorrow's show, so we've mentioned it quite a bit, the importance of Bobby Portis. And I even joked about, look, we know Bobby's been good and certainly very deserving of the 6-man award, but some of the numbers that may even surprise even the most hardcore Bucks fans that have been through all 82 of these games. And that's important to point out too, because so is Bobby, all 82 games. So on tomorrow's show, we are going to get into the candidacy of Bobby Portis for the 6th Man of the Year award and continue to look ahead to this series with the Indiana Pacers. Maybe we'll learn more developments about Giannis and his availability in this series. So certainly stay tuned for that. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow. I'm Locked On Bucks.